Okay, can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the critique, um, what is a critique? It usually disputes something other than the desirability of the AF's proposed policy or plan and says that that should be a sufficient win condition for the neg. They can critique things like the AF's epistemology, which is their way of thinking or the way they produce knowledge, or their ontology, which is their sort of way of being. Usually, these are based in some philosophical area of study. Common ones say that capitalism is bad or make arguments about identity politics. So, anti Black racism, feminism, colonialism Ks are all very common. Um, why are Ks strategic? The majority of teams, even good ones, are incredibly terrible at answering them. Even amongst the best of the best, there's like the K is often their one massive weakness because there's a huge prep disparity. For most policy teams, the most amount of time they can allocate to prepping the K is maybe 10-15% of their overall prep, whereas you can shift the locus of the debate to whatever next questions. You spend all your time researching, and if you really know your stuff in the theory, you'll be able to win your arguments regardless of their truth. The other thing is speaker point inflation is very real for K teams. I think that between two equally skilled debaters, one policy and one K, the K debater will outspeak the policy debater most of the time because it's easier to sound passionate and use sophisticated language. I don't think that's a reason to go for the argument, but it's something to note. So the parts of a critique. First is framework. This is a debate about what the debate should be and what the win conditions are for each side. So the fundamental question is, if the AF proves the plan is good, do they win? The AF thinks that we should use an interpretation known as plan focus, where the neg must prove that the plan is undesirable by disputing it with disadvantages, counterplans, etc. The second interpretation that can be advocated for by either side, but more commonly the neg, is a middle ground, which says that the neg can get offense off of the AF's performance or ideology or epistemology, ontology, the terms they used earlier, but the AF still gets to weigh the plan against it. And either side can advocate this, but like I said, more commonly the neg. The third interpretation is just hard for the neg. It's called you link, you lose, where it says the neg can get offense off of the AF's performance, ideology, etc., and the AF does not get to weigh the plan. The thing here is if the neg wins it, it is very easy for the neg to win the debate because the AF doesn't really have a way to get offense because they're not allowed to weigh the plan. And the neg will always be able to out prepare them and beat them on their reasons why ideology is bad. Um, so your offense on framework and the reasons to prefer the interpretation is so framework is a debate about models of debate. So the AF is going to say an interpretation, you will say a counter interpretation of how debate should operate, and then you need offense to compare those things to win why one is preferable. So your offense should be about the benefits of debate under your model versus theirs. You need to win that debate is an educational space, so we should be aware of the consequences of what we say and think. You can also say that discourse is central to policymaking, thus, it should be a relevant consideration to maximize political education and create better policies, which can oftentimes give you inroads into AF offense about why training politicians with good skills is valuable. Another point of offense can be how the reading of framework in itself is somehow harmful or steeped in harmful legacies. Teams in the past have analogized it to policing, like the anti-blackness critique, assimilation, the colonialism critique, etc. These aren't terribly strategic, in my opinion, because it's really hard to substantiate those allegations a lot of the time. But if mishandled, gives you a great way to access offense in round. Um, the rest of the K functions like a disad and a counterplan. So the links are something, it's exactly like a disad should prove that the AF is bad in some way. They should usually be to some underlying ideology the AF assumes. They can also be to the plan's consequence, like a disad link would be, which I'll get to later. B is the impact. I think, in my opinion, the best way to do this is to get creative. You should go for an impact that the AF cannot solve and think of creative ways to outweigh and turn the case. So even if the AF wins some argument about why extinction comes before your impact, you can still win the debate. And then the alternative, in my experience, boils down to one of two things. Option one is basically just kind of thinking differently. So instead of thinking on this topic, for example, instead of thinking about IP rights in a racist or capitalist way, we should think about it in an anti-racist or anti-capitalist way. This might spill out to make better policies, but it may also just be good in itself to be less racist and capitalist as scholars in this space. The second option is some sort of revolution that says we should materially change the structures that enable bad things to happen in the first place. In my opinion, these are oftentimes less strategic because not only do you have to win what that revolution would look like, it can be very hard to beat arguments about like why the military might crack down on a revolution, and just empirical examples of revolutions failing, particularly recently in the US. Like that, there's obviously a lot of examples of why grassroots movements are not the best form of politics. So that's something to keep in mind. So the two main styles of critiques. First is the disad counterplan style, where you go for links impact as a disad to the AF and the plan, and then the alternative is a counterplan that solves it and should try to solve the AF. So these debates are oftentimes about the big picture. You should try to win your theory of power, which is your explanation of how the world works and how violence works in the world, and try to apply that to plan-specific links with an alternative that can solve the links and probably the case. You should go for a middle ground counterinterpretation on framework that allows you to get links to more than just the plan, and you should debate the case. Second is framework. Debates here end up being more technical and detail-oriented. You need to first win your model of debate is preferable, and then explain how you win under your model of debate. You should advocate the you link, you lose interpretation and make the debate a debate about debate, which means it is, in the 2&R, oftentimes in these debates, 4 minutes will be spent on framework, and then 1 minute will just clean up the rest of the K. The 2&R usually does not have an alternative, and links are pretty unimportant because you only need to win a 1% risk of a link under the you link, you lose interpretation, because the AF has literally zero way to get offense. The whole idea of the you link, you lose interpretation is if AF was racist or capitalist, whatever, reject AF regardless of other benefits that they can access, because it is like on face, it's just, in any way bad to affirm racism or capitalism or whatever ism that you're going for. It is bad to do that, so we should just reject them. The third style that I think is the most strategic is a combination of the two. So the best critiques have a viable 2&R in both styles. The common examples I would say are settler colonialism and anti-blackness, where it is just as easy to go for a link to the plan with an alt that solves the case as it is to go for some trick on framework or some K of like a representation or piece of performance in the 1AC. Okay, I'm going to answer this question in a second real quick. Okay, so I think the combination is the best way to nuke the 1AR's time allocation because it can be very difficult for the 1AR to spend enough time on framework and spend enough time answering the alternative and clean the rest of the K. Okay, now I'm going to answer the question. How do we argue thinking? Okay, yeah. So there's a few ways to approach that. So first, I think you should make an argument about proximity, which is just that, we can't actually create the plan. We can't actually pass a policy, which means that the AF saying, we can do practical, pragmatic politics. No, you cannot. You can imagine doing pragmatic politics, but that is not the same. So you need to be making argument when comparing thinking differently as an alternative. You should not be comparing thinking differently versus doing the plan. You should be comparing thinking differently versus imagining doing the plan. And then in that case, you force the AF to prove why imagining political change is more valuable than thinking in a more anti-racist, ethical way, etc. The second thing I think you need to say, if you're going for the thinking differently alternative as a sort of global thing, like out there, is it not just in debate, is that it's a prerequisite to better political change. Every policy obviously has to have some underlying ideology that justifies it, right? Like you need to have something that drives you to make political change. So what you should say is that absent the alternative, just doing the AF alone ensures that the AF will fail. They call this serial policy failure, where the AF can do as much as they want, but until they change their mindset, they will stay trapped in a loop of racism, capitalism, whatever, because that is the status quo, which is your uniqueness argument. And the AF fails to reconcile that, which means it ends up being bad in some way, which is a disad to the plan, regardless of the thinking differently thing. So hopefully that answers that question. So critiques on this topic. These are not like original ideas for me by any means. These are pretty generic, but I think that they're both extra strategic on this topic. So first is the capitalism critique. This will follow the disad counterplan formula most of the time. It says that capitalism is bad and IP rights protection reinvests in capitalist logics. The very idea of property is like very obviously the foundation for capitalism. The idea that one can have rights to property is certainly a privatization logic. And you should say that that is mutually exclusive with the alternative, which would be global anti-capitalist resistance that somehow establishes and brings to power a communist party. I think the best part of the CAPK is the impact. If you can win that capitalism is A, unsustainable, and B, causes extinction, it's really easy to just take out the rest of their arguments because of the unsustainability thing. So if capitalism is unsustainable, i.e., it will inevitably collapse and inevitably cause extinction at some point down the line, it doesn't matter if the AF can solve their impact, because if you vote AF to do the plan without the alternative, extinction still happens. So then everything else just becomes try or die, because there's only a risk that the alt can maybe solve the AF, but it solves capitalism, which still outweighs. The second idea I have is the set qual K on this topic, I think will be very good. The logic of intellectual property is very colonial. There's a lot of literature on this, but indigenous people don't share our definitions of property. Those are rooted in mastery that sort of presupposes the settler's ability to own knowledge as property, which underlies conquest on the frontier of knowledge. Think of like forced assimilation schools, the Dawes Act, things like this, attempt to kind of conquer knowledge. That logic is colonial. The other thing is you can go for a creative alternative about indigenous ways of handling intellectual property, i.e., like oral history is a good example of this. A lot of indigenous groups don't have like privatized understandings of knowledge. They're passed down orally through generations, which you could say is, a better alternative to intellectual property rights protection, or intellectual property protection. This K can follow either formula. The 2NR can either be a heavy framework push about why the AF's ideology is colonial, and that is like on face bad, or you can go for an alternative like I just explained, or one that materially gives land back, ends the settler nation state, something like that. And those you can get really creative with alt solvency and explaining how it solves the AF, which I think is good. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about answered critiques. So regardless of whether you want to go for critique and care about anything I just said, you need to listen to this, because like I said on the first slide, it's a lot of teams' biggest weaknesses, and you don't want to fall in that group. So first, I want to talk about framework. This is the biggest thing. It's usually all you need in a 2AR. Most K teams at this point in debates evolution won't debate the case. So if you win, you get to weigh the plan versus the alternative. Extinction will probably be an 100% risk impact and almost certainly outweigh. I'll explain that later. But fairness is, there are sort of two impacts to framework that you should go for. First is fairness. It's an impact that you should explain in only this debate. So regardless of whether their model of debate over the course of a season is more valuable, we have an impact that the ballot solves, which they do not, which means ours should proceed. So the internal links to both fairness and clash really are AF ground and predictability. Remember those terms, AF ground, predictability. So if the neg gets to dispute any part of the AF, what stops them from going for a K out of singular words, high letter color, fonts, etc.? Those all sound silly and vacuous, but without an objective line drawn that limits the neg to answering the plan, the AF just gets killed by an infinite number of unpredictable Ks, off of which they cannot generate responsive offense. So the AF ground part of that would be the AF can't possibly answer every representation that the neg can critique because there are so many of them that there's just no answer to. Or that the predictability part comes in, which is that the AF cannot predict an infinite number of Ks. So the neg will always be more prepared, and that dialogue is not valuable. The reason why fairness is an impact is the fairness paradox. This gets a little complicated. So, say in the chat if you're confused. In order to prove something outweighs fairness, you rely on the judge evaluating that argument fairly, which proves that fairness is a precondition for every other aspect of the game. The idea here is to prove that fairness is a meta ethic that is just regardless of where it is applied or how it is applied, it is always good to uphold fairness. And fairness is the basis for every other part of the game, not just your framework interpretation, right? Like when you get up in the 2&R and make arguments, you expect that the judge flows them. You expect that the judge evaluates them fairly. You expect that the judge does not just vote AF because they're having a bad day and don't like your shoes or, something like that. So you expect fairness. So the AF expects fairness. It's a fair reciprocal exchange, and fairness must be upheld. The second part that's kind of tricky, and a lot of teams mess up, is ballot solvency. The only thing that the ballot can proactively and reverse causally solve is unfairness. So the idea is that unfairness does not happen when the neg gets to read a critique. Unfairness happens when the neg gets to when the AF is punished by the neg winning with the critique. So the neg can read the K and the AF can answer it. As long as the judge votes AF, there was no unfairness because the AF was not ever punished for being unprepared to beat an unpreparable argument. So the ballot proactively solves that by preventing there from ever being something unfair in the first place. But for example, if the neg goes for offense about you were racist or you were capitalist, the ballot cannot solve that because the racism, the capitalism, like those things were already done. You can't undo them. Thus, it's more pragmatic and useful to contribute the ballot against fairness or against unfairness. So how the neg should answer fairness is I think you need to dispute that fairness is an intrinsic good to the game. I think personally that logic is very tautological and that at some point, debaters' education and well-being should precede the procedure of the game. So the main thing to remember here is that you need to ask about this in cross-ex. You need to ask, why is fairness an impact? They'll say something like, because it upholds the game. Then you ask, why is the game necessarily valuable to uphold? They'll say something like, because it's fair. But absent winning some external reason why the game is good, fairness is vacuous. It means nothing. You can't, it's like they say fairness is good because upholding the game is good. Then they say upholding the game is good because fairness is good. That like we all see why that's circular and self-referential, and it's not an impact. So the second impact that the AF needs to go for is clash. This should be, unlike fairness, explained in the context of models of debate. So if a model were in place for a full season, what would debaters take away from that experience educationally? The biggest thing to note is that clash is content agnostic. Your argument should not be that we learn more about the topic, but that we become better researchers, arguers, etc., which primes us to come to more informed conclusions in the future. Presumably, this solves the neg's offense because they'll usually say some reason why their framework interpretation provides a better model for education that can steer us away from something like racism, capitalism, etc. You should say that they do not do that, but that you do, because you produce people who are well practiced in refining and synthesizing information to come to very informed conclusions, at which point they'll inevitably conclude, obviously, that racism is bad, capitalism is bad, etc., if that's what the facts support. The key internal link to clash is preparation. When both sides know what they'll be debating far in advance, they're able to effectively iterate in a balanced fashion. But when one side is unprepared and one side is over-prepared, there's no value in that dialogue because it'll result in the same thing either way. There's no incentive for the AF to keep researching if they're just going to get killed by the set call K every round. I think the way the neg should answer this is you should say, one, Clash is not content agnostic. It certainly matters what we discuss. Researching, white supremacy is not the same as researching counter tactics to, resist white supremacy. And the second part of this is even if content is agnostic, we know that we're racist in the status quo, and we should not become better arguers if we're just going to be arguing for harmful ideologies like racism, capitalism, etc. So it is better to produce a bunch of unskilled people than it is to produce a bunch of skilled people if we know that they're somewhat racist now. Or capitalist, whatever. Sorry, I'm defaulting to racism as an example because it's where the majority of Ks go at this point. But that's, yeah. The last part of framework is subject formation. So the idea of this debate is the debate over whether or not debate, and specifically the ballot, changes who we are as people, our character, our beliefs, etc. So the AF's argument should be that if the ballot does not make debaters less racist, there's no reason to vote neg, even if the 1AC was racist. The warrants for this that I think are the best are first is lying. Teams read arguments like warming good, knowing that it's just like it's just wrong scientifically, like all of the facts dispute this, but they'll still read it because they want the ballot. You need to theorize that debaters, first and foremost, are competitive, which overcodes any possible other incentive for coming to debate. So they can, it is okay for them to think that or that didn't make any sense. Okay, so if debaters are first and foremost competitive, then debate is not educational and it does not shape their beliefs because they're willing to lie in order to get the ballot. They obviously do not believe those things, and winning with those arguments like warming good does not make them any more likely to believe it. It just means that they did the better debating in that debate. The second warrant is switching sides, which is kind of similar. So you can read hedge good in one debate, and then the next debate, read hedge bad. You can go for, I don't know, on last topic, like, you can go for the UBI AF, and then the next debate, you'll turn around, your neg, the AF discloses the UBI AF. And even though you supposedly believe it because you just went for the argument, you're going to have to negate it because you're neg. And you would every time. Just because you believe the UBI does not mean you would just like forfeit and say, like, okay, you're right. You said the truth. Like, this is not how debate works. So the third warrant is doubling down, which is offense and kind of a link turn to their stuff. The idea is that since debaters are competitively motivated, as we've established, losing to an argument makes them more likely to backlash to that argument and start researching the opposite so they can be better equipped to beat it. When a team reads a hedge good AF and says that America is the greatest country ever known to man, and then they lose to the anti-blackness K, they're not going to suddenly start researching the anti-blackness K. They're going to suddenly start researching why the US has been historically good to Black people. And they're going to be better and better at winning these racist arguments, which makes them even more racist people, even if they are correct that debate influences our beliefs. The other big thing to note is that despite what the neg will say most of the time, Clash is certainly not a double turn with saying that debate does not shape our beliefs. Because, like I said earlier, Clash is content agnostic. You can think that debate does not indoctrinate us with a certain set of ideals, but it certainly does give us the skills to come to our own conclusions, which I already explained. The way the neg should handle the subject formation debate is say that debate unconsciously influences us, right? Like, obviously there are disparate, obviously we have to lie and switch sides at some points, but when the community over time repetitively keeps winning on the anti-blackness K, we become more attuned to realize that maybe it is the truth that, IP rights are anti-Black. If it's such a good argument, regardless of who is reading it, it's very successful, which means that the truth of it is probably, it's probably very true. The second thing is that over time, debate has evolved at the hands of ballots. The only explanation for why debate moves in the ways it does is because ballots govern competitive incentives. The reason why trends change is because those are what wins. So even if the AF wins, the debaters are competitively motivated, you can spin that back as your argument because if they're competitively motivated and you win on the anti-blackness K, that means other teams are incentivized to pick up a book about anti-blackness and start reading and start getting good at going for that critique because it wins. So that's how I think the neg should handle that. The last part of answering the critique is debating the K proper. So absent framework, the 2NR will devolve to either thinking harder or some kind of revolution, which I explained earlier. There are a few basic stock answers to this that you should cut some evidence for, although a lot of good cards already exist and are kind of out there. You should certainly give 2AR redos on this and get good at explaining your answers in cross-ex. The first and biggest one is government reform good. Sounds generic, but it's very good against identity Ks like anti-blackness, colonialism, etc., because those things are very commonly make a claim that the alternative cannot work with the state and that politics based in governmental structures, specifically the United States, will always fail. If they don't say those things, you should just go for the perm and explain how the AF is in the direction of the alternative because it helps Black people, helps Indigenous people, insert marginalized group that the next K is of. And then you should say, they don't have a reason why we can't work with the state. So they don't have a reason why we can't work with the AF, like we are good for Black people in this instance. The alternative is in the same direction. So permutation solves and they're not mutually exclusive. Oftentimes the warrants for why state-based politics will always fail get very jargony and they usually mean nothing. So I think the most strategic way to beat that argument is find examples. So this is going to differ like a little bit based on what critique you're trying to beat and what the AF is, but find examples of just like, ways that the state has helped Black people in the past, ways the state has helped Indigenous people in the past. And all of those things are reasons why the AF could be the same. The only answer that they'll have to specific examples is like, we should not use examples to like let white people off the hook for the broad history of violence they've done. Like, yes, we should not say that violence is over just because a few good things have happened for marginalized populations, but we should not also similarly let white people off the hook for resistance by saying nothing can ever get better, so we're just going to keep things how they are. Obviously, that's a worse solution. Like, come on. Second is capitalism good? This pretty much only applies to the cap K, but there are a lot of other theories that also take issue with capitalism, so it's good to have in the toolbox, I guess. There's a lot of literature to substantiate a lot of different impacts here. So, get creative, find something the neg won't have cards for. K debaters are pretty notorious for being lazy researchers. So if you can kind of innovate and get some new impact scenarios, you'll probably be pretty successful going for that argument. So yeah, and then the last thing is the permutation. So the perm double bind is just about unbeatable if you win the extinction outweighs. The first part of that is winning extinction outweighs. I think there are only two warrants you need, and it's like a pretty intuitive argument. So one is scope. Extinction kills everybody, including whatever marginalized population the neg is going for critique of. If you asked, the majority of Black people, Indigenous people, etc., would they rather go extinct or, like racism takes a little bit longer to solve, then they would obviously rather not go extinct because no one wants to die, right? And I think the majority of people would rather stay alive, and the AF should not get to, or the neg should not get to speak for those people and decide that they must die because of the alternative. So the second part of that, and it's also just a numbers thing that's like impacts are weighed on the basis of magnitude times probability. Your magnitude is not just the 8 billion people that already exist, but the infinite future generations that would exist if we were to not go extinct. That's where the second part comes in, which is irreversibility. Extinction is irreversible, unlike the neg's impact, which can inevitably be solved down the line with something else, even if it's not the alternative or the AF. That will inevitably be solved by something else. But they preclude the possibility of solving it by, dooming us to extinction, because infinite future generations of humanity that would have been happy or able to stick up for, those issues that the neg is proclaimed, those people don't even get to exist, which means we never know what would have happened. So it's not, that is not good. Then the second part of this is the perm double bind. So the argument is permutation do both. We should do the AF alongside the alternative. And so I'll explain this in the context of the cap K. So status quo is capitalist. AF is if the neg wins the link, AF is a tiny bit more capitalist or keeps capitalism in place. The argument is if the alternative can overcome the status quo, i.e., it can overcome the massive amounts of capitalism that already exist, it can certainly also overcome the AF. Like, the AF is a good use of capitalism in this instance if you win the AF, if you win the case, because it stops extinction. So the argument is perm do both. If the alternative can overcome the status quo and solve, then it can also overcome the AF, and you can also permute them. But if it can't overcome the status quo, and if it can't overcome the tiny tweak to capitalism that is the AF, then it likely can't solve in the first place because it's such a weak movement with, it's very weak structurally, and can't overcome tiny things like that. You can also get tricky with perms like do the AF, then give the land back, do the AF through a communist party for the cap K. These are, I think, pretty unworkable if answered correctly. But answered correctly is a big if. So go for it. At least make the 2NC a bit harder. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say about the critique. And then I'll send these out, but these are just a bunch of other like lectures for more specific things that I didn't have time for, and then a bunch of good debates that I think everyone should watch. So I'll do questions now. Okay, how would you answer the perm double bind? So, okay, let me get back to that. I think that this is the biggest problem with the neg strategy of going for a disad counterplan style K, like the cap K. I think that I have not discovered the answer to the perm double bind, to be completely honest, but I think there are a couple ways you can go about it. So, like the most obvious one is you just need to win, like you need to out specify them. You need to win a specific warrant why why the AFs change to IP rights would specifically make the alternative impossible, not just the status quo. Second is if you're winning the impact calculus part of the debate, the sustainability, like capitalism is unsustainable and capitalism causes extinction. It's like the try or die thing I said earlier. It's like you can probably, even if they win the perm double bind, you can probably win because try or die means there's no reason to risk it. But yeah, I mean, if you're like thinking about the K and discover an answer to the perm double bind midway through the season, like let me know, because like in the status quo, I just think this argument is like I don't know how you beat it. Other questions? Okay. I'll keep talking about the perm double bind until someone asks another question. I think that is another reason why disad counterplan Ks are less strategic, and you should always have an out. Like you should always be able to give it to an R where you don't have to go for a material alternative, and you should be always able to give it to an R where the whole debate is just about framework and just about one part of the AFS ideology that is flawed. Because otherwise, I think perm double bind is like perm double bind plus extinction outweighs is just like very easy and very bread and butter for these policy people who are used to giving like disad counterplan style speeches. Whereas you as a K debater, if you choose that path, will be more well versed in framework. So it's like utilizing that prep disparity that I talked about in like the very first slide would indicate that K debaters should stick to what they're good at and stick to the framework parts of the debate as opposed to going for like these policy style perm double bind susceptible arguments. All right. Another question. Okay. How do I decide whether to go all in on framework or links in an alt for the 2NR? Okay, so this is a good question, and it's also kind of not really answerable. There's not really like a cookie cutter answer to this. I think it takes experience and it takes a lot of losses to realize, like should have gone for the, other option. I think the first thing is if you can win just by going for framework, then just go for framework. It is much simpler. It is a cleaner path to victory. There's a lot less moving parts, and it is much harder for the AF to come back from that because it's much more like technical. Like if you drop something on framework, the 2AR just like doesn't get new answers. Whereas if you drop like a minute thing on like the links in the alt, then the AF can kind of, if the AF drops like a little thing on links in the alt, then they can kind of out explain you, because that's a much more like big picture style debate where like if they beat your theory of power, if they beat like the alternative, if they beat one of those things, the whole thing collapses. Whereas framework, it's like if you win framework, you're gonna win, because you only need like a tiny risk of a link, which I think I also should have clarified earlier. If you go for framework, you still need a link to the AF. Like you need to win not only that your framework interpretation is better, but also like a reason why you win under that framework interpretation. Otherwise, it's still AF on presumption because you haven't disproven the AF. Although the link can be like 30 seconds in the 2NR, because usually if you have I guess I can talk about strategy here. So I think if the K is going to be the whole block, 2NC should do the whole K proper. 1NR should do only framework. 1NR can just spam a bunch of framework arguments. 1AR will mess them up because they don't get to cross-hex them. They don't know what you're talking about a lot of the time. And they don't get to prep them during 2NC cross-hex. So the 1AR will mess up framework, hopefully. And then 2NC will be able to spam like, usually what I do in the 2NC is I do all of the line by line, and then I get to links with like 4 minutes left, and I just say like 12 links. And so if the 1AR drops one of those, it's like it's over. Like, if you win framework and a link, and especially if it's dropped, like GG. But even if they don't, you should ideally have like strong enough links where if the 1AR answers them, you can still go for them. And then in that case, it's also pretty clean, I think. So that's how I would split the block. If no one has any more questions, I can go through like a K shell on this topic. Okay, I don't see any, so I'll do that. I'll watch the chat if there are any. But okay, so this is, and I think like the Georgetown thing, the Georgetown packet, but the racial scripts critique. So this is I think like a very well written file. I think that it effectively utilizes the combination that I was talking about earlier. There is like a 2NR where you go for the disad counterplan style, and there's a 2NR where you go for only framework. So yeah, I think this is like very strategic. The shell essentially is the impact and theory of power first, which I think is good in disad counterplan style debates. You should start with your theory of power. This one is racial capitalism. The idea that racial capitalism, the way that the West utilizes the rest of the world in the quest for capital, is violent, causes resource exploitation, and eventually extinction. Those things are obviously cause extinction. So, and then they have like, this is just like a tag writing thing, but this like framing thing. The question is not how to slow down, but how to move on. I think that's a good analytic because it sort of establishes the try or die thing as early as the 1NC. So this card is just explaining why racial capitalism is bad, explaining why it causes all these impacts. You see a lot of slavery, genocide, ecosystems, cultures, like all these things are, good buzzwords to have. And then you have gender's collapse, slow degradation, unprecedented magnitude, really valuable to have in an impact card. And then you have the link debate. So I've seen a lot of people cutting this book. Kind of sucks because I was cutting it, and then all the camps released it in the starter packet, so I'm not really original anymore. But it's a really good card. Describes how intellectual property is racist. Describes how it ensures the continuation of racial capitalism, which is sort of the link debate, and explains why it's both a link to the plan, i.e., the process of shoring up and protecting intellectual property rights, why that is racist and explains why the underlying way of thinking and ideology of the AF and representations of the AF are also racist. So, really good link card as well. And then the alternative, vote negative for decolonization of intellectual property. I think keeping the alternative vague in the 1NC is very strategic. So the one thing is rescripts. It's sort of two parts. Rescripts racial logics. This is clearly to me like a framework angle. Like, instead of racist logics, we should have anti-racist logics. It's pretty simple. Like that's all you really need to say. And then articulates new resistance outside the confines of the racial contract. This part is where I think the 2NC can get tricky. If you can just get up in the 2NC and claim that the 2AC like somehow misunderstood the alternative, even if they answer it perfectly, you should like completely shift what the alternative means in the 2NC as long as you can find some sort of evidentiary basis for it. And then you can kind of get away with like all new answers and you don't have to do too much work to like kill what the 2AC said. So I think that is also like a very strategic thing. And then the other thing you'll notice is framework does not appear in the 1NC, which I think is like also good. Framework should come in the 2NC because then you can have more time, you can spam more tricks, things like that. So if anyone else has any more questions, otherwise, oh, yes, I will send the link to the, give me a second to find it. I think I'm going to have to stop screen sharing for this because someone sent it to me and I don't want to, in case it's not supposed to be out, but. Wait. Oh, okay. I sent the link to the Georgetown Dropbox that has this file.